Canada has 5 problems that you have to take into account because all of them affect real estate. The first one is geographic and political. The population is stretched out, basically hugging the American border for warmth. And because of the way that Canada was formed as a co-dominion of Anglos in Ontario and Quebecois in Quebec, you have made the decision very early on in your process that the provinces have immense power vis-a-vis the central government. That means you didn't get your first trade deal until about 3 years ago. When I say trade deal, not with another country, within Canada. So internal barriers to trade remain immense, and almost every province in the Canadian system, as this graphic shows, has a greater an economic relationship south with the United States than it does with their own co-nationals. And in that sort of environment, Canada is always going to be incredibly exposed to international trends, especially as involves the elephant next door. Now, you fast forward 10 years, you do away with provincial autonomy somehow, that changes. I don't think that's going to happen in 10 years.
If we're not trading enough between provinces, what do you see as being the biggest opportunities for us to do more there?
You have become so used to exporting raw commodities to the wider world because the United States has most of what it needs already, and then just participating in American automotive because that's where the market is. If you really, really, really do want to have a cross-Canadian system for trade, you're going to have a much more efficient east-west transport system. But I'm not sure that will work with NAFTA clauses because you have to allow north-south to work just as well as east-west under the clauses of the new treaty. So anything that you do is going to be for integration has to be between large population centers. And the only 2 large population centers that Canada has in very close proximity that can get synergies are Montreal and Toronto. And so for you to solve that, you have to solve the core Canadian identity question over what it means to be Canadian, and it has to be the Anglos of Toronto and the Quebecois of Quebec who answer that question the same way for this to work. That's a question you're very familiar with, and I think if you had an answer to it, you would have provided it already. Problem number 2 is strategic. This is a Cold War map. All the dots are where the Russians had their military bases. During the Cold War, Canada was in a privileged position. Now, the United States had created globalization in order to build an alliance to fight the Soviets. And whenever we tried to get a trade relationship with other countries, we always had to give in a little bit because we got full security control as a result. So that was the guns for butter trade that defined the Cold War and American strategic policy. Now, Canada, because it's on the flight path for the missiles from the Soviet Union to the United States, could have been a security free rider. You could have been neutral. To your credit, you chose not to. In fact, to your credit, the Canadians were always the first ones for any fight. If they saw a crisis in the world, they'd pick up the phone, they'd call the president, and the first words the Canadian Prime Minister always said is, "We see what's happening, we're here, how can we help?" And that made Canada our fastest friend. But you weren't dumb about it. The next words out of the Canadians' mouth after all the security details were worked out, be like, "We would really appreciate a little bit more market access for Quebecois cheese or Ontarian spark plugs," or whatever it happened to be, softwood timber, if you will. On over 70 different occasions, Canada carved little melon scoop exemptions out of American trade law, and all of those were folded into NAFTA 1. And that's how things lasted. Until this guy came along. We've been moving away from the globalist approach in the United States for some time, but Donald Trump was the first one to make it the centerpiece of his foreign policy. And he loved Trudeau, because Trudeau was perceived around the world as the only world leader that Donald Trump was smarter than. With that in his back pocket, Trump played hardball on trade negotiations, and all of those exemptions that Canada had spent 40 years building into American trade law were jettisoned in the NAFTA 2 discussions. The only reason that there's even an adjudication function in there isn't because of Canada, it's because Nancy Pelosi put it in at the last second within the US House. Now, as we all know, Justin Trudeau is not the brainchild that is running Canada. That would be Christina Freeland. And at the time that Trump became president, she was your trade negotiator and ultimately your foreign minister. And she attempted to play the old playbook in the NAFTA negotiations. The idea that Canada has a special place in American trade law and is justified in getting its exemptions. And I'm not saying this to denigrate her. I think she's one of the smartest people on the planet right now. But her first week on the job was Trump's first week on the job. And she was handed a playbook that became obsolete the day she took her office. And so she was pushing for things into NAFTA 2 that the United States had no interest in, on labor, on environmental regulations. And at the end of the day, the Americans got sick of it and cut a bilateral deal with the Mexicans to cut Canada out of NAFTA completely. And this is the photo from the stage when she found out. The Mexican and the American negotiators didn't tell her ahead of time. And after this meeting, she was simply told, the United States is going to proceed with this in 8 days with the Mexicans. You have 8 days to accept the original terms. If you don't, fine, you're on your own. 7 days later, Justin Trudeau signed, and we got NAFTA 2. Problem number 3, geography. What you're looking at here is not a population density map. It is a spatial expansion map. So cities that are in green or blue are not very physically constrained. They can expand in almost all directions. That keeps development costs low. Cities that are in red and orange have difficulty. Maybe they have an ocean or a mountain or a national park or some sort of protected wetlands or something. They can't physically expand very easily. And so their internal land costs tend to be very high. That makes for expensive housing. We've got 3 trends that are going on in Anglo-America right now, same on both sides of the border. Number 1, because of COVID, not a lot of people want to be reliant on public transport. Cities with a circle can't function without city transport, so people are moving out. Number 2, the baby boomers on both sides of the border want to move somewhere warm. They don't want to shovel snow in February. They're moving south, or in the case of Canada, west. And then third, the millennials are coming of age, they're raising families, and they want to be in a place where they can have a backyard. They have to move to a place where land costs are lower. So we're seeing people moving out of the coastal cities, and that's on both sides of the border, into the interior, specifically in the American South, Southwest, and West. You guys don't have a lot of room. I know that Canada is a freaking huge country, but if you start preferencing away from Vancouver and Montreal and Toronto, there aren't a lot of other options. And so you're seeing significant distortions across your entire labor structure. Fourth, demographics. Here's your provincial demographics as of a couple of years ago. You'll notice a couple things about Ontario, Quebec, and BC. You guys have, for the most part, stopped having kids a while ago. You are rapidly aging. Not into obsolescence, we're not there yet. But in this decade, that big bulge of people in their 50s will have moved into their 60s. And then the economic case for the 3 biggest Canadian provinces, it's very, very difficult. Because you're going to have to tax your young people in order to support your retirees. And if the taxes get too high and the services get too low for the young people, they will relocate. Alberta to this point has been a bit of an exception because of the oil boom. It has drawn people in from the other provinces, especially people in their 20s and 30s who are still going to have kids. And that makes Alberta your youngest demographic structure in the entire country. But the housing stock that you have in the rest of the country is not necessarily appropriate for the way your demographic structure is evolving, except, again, possibly in Alberta. And that mismatch in an environment of capital shortages, in an environment when we need to double the size of the industrial plant, means that there's a contest for every single dollar that is available for investment. Do you put it into industrial plant? Do you put it into infrastructure? Do you put it into training? Do you put it into housing? You're going to have to choose.
So what is it about Alberta that makes its housing stock set up the best for its demographics and for immigration?
Sure. The tar sands boom really got going about 15 years ago. And in the first year, the Albertans were attracting people from all over Canada with a heavy emphasis, of course, on the Maritimes because the economic dislocations there have been pretty rough. But most of the people who were coming were in their 20s. And that meant they were mostly men. And within a couple years, it became apparent that Calgary really needed to recruit a wider array of people in order so that these people were not doing what happens in the United States and just living in pan camps. And so the decision was made early on to put a lot of effort into building larger apartments and single-family homes so that these young men who were coming in could actually have a reason to bring someone with them, maybe bring kids with them. And then the expansion of the economy within Calgary itself attracted a lot of women from all parts of Canada in order to do the non-oil jobs. And all of a sudden, you've got people from BC and people from Nova Scotia falling in love in Calgary and buying a single-family home. And it's the one place in Canada where most of the housing construction was not catering to foreigners. So it wasn't just condos. It was actually people who wanted yards. And that made for a very, very different property market in Alberta compared to everywhere else. Now, to this point, Canada has always had a trump card: immigration. As long as you are bringing in people in their 20s and their 30s and their early 40s, people have already finished their primary and secondary education somewhere else, so you don't have to pay for it. But then they come in and they work for 30 or 40 years before they retire. You have been able to function on a bit of a treadmill. The people who come in, as long as they're young enough, have enough time to pay into the system to then pay for their own retirement. But if they don't come in until they're in their 40s, they will never pay in enough to justify the budgetary expense that it takes. Until recently, this has just barely held up. But what has happened under COVID is the input pipeline has stopped. In addition, the nature of immigration that you've attracted in the last years has been dramatically different from what's come before. It's no longer people who are coming to work and live forever. It's people who come and drop some money, maybe establish residency, but don't actually work and then move on. And they use their financial assets to buy physical assets in Canada, primarily real estate, that they then do not live in. And because they're either fleeing the European financial crisis or the Chinese breakdown, they're relatively cost insensitive when they're evaluating property. Because from their point of view, if 10, 15 years from now, the property is only worth half what they paid for it, for them that's still a win, because it means they got half their money out of a dying system. That has been your primary investment portfolio for the last few years. And that means that most economic activity in some of your provinces has been real estate based, upwards of 30, 40% in BC specifically. And a lot of the Canadian provinces are getting 3, 4% of their tax intake from nothing more than transferring titles from one real estate owner to another. That treadmill is now breaking down. Two things. Number one, the world is opening up a little bit more. And so there's a different class of people that's looking to leave as these other systems really approach the brink. They're older, they have more money. So all the distorting things that we've been talking about here are going to get worse. And second, because so many foreigners have bought so much property in so many gateway cities in Canada, a lot of Canadians cannot afford to live in their own country anymore. That has a political impact. And so the Trudeau government, effective January 1, has put restrictions on the ability of foreigners to own real estate. So how will this all shake out? Way too soon to tell. The ban's only been in place for a week and a half. And it's going to change the nature of who's coming to Canada. And we're already feeling that pressure south of the border as some of it diverts. As a rule, all else being equal, most foreigners would rather be in Canada than the United States. It's considered more politically friendly. Or it was until January 1. And now the economic issue really, really, really matters. Deal with the last factor, the fifth one. What we're looking at here is American data again. The gray and the yellow is the same as that first slide. So that's net worth by decade. And that's everyone, that's average. The blue and the orange is median. So it removes the top and the bottom 1%. In the United States, half of all financial assets are held by the top 1%. And that means that in the United States, yes, we have a massive inequality issue. We're not going to solve that on a podcast. But it also means that when you retire, if you're in the top 1%, you don't have to liquidate your entire portfolio. You probably only liquidate a third or a half of it. And that leaves a significant amount of capital engaged. The challenge that Canada is going to face is it has a more traditional wealth distribution, so domestic capital is dropping significantly and will stay low for a very long time. That means imported capital is what's going to be driving it. The United States is going to be the source for most of that simply because of this disparity within our own economic equality on the south side of the border. And then third, you're going to have a lot of desperate, hungry, scared money from the wider world looking for a way to land in Canada in an environment of a real estate block. A lot of moving pieces that are going to require both the provinces and Ottawa to come up with different policies. What Trudeau has done on the first, it makes sense to me. Whether or not it's going to work, I do not know. But I know it's kind of only the opening gambit for the changes in policy that we should expect to see over the next several years. And if you play it wrong, the treadmill that keeps Canada functioning stops. And that, among other things, might mean that Canada is not able to participate in the reindustrialization of North America. Because if Canada can't draw those people in, it no longer has the workforce that is necessary to do the reindustrialization in the first place. So there's a lot of things that get tangled up here that Canada is going to have to assign values to and then muddle its way forward as we enter the most dynamic period in North American history since the War of 1812.
So, I mean, capital is always scarce, but it's going to be a period of increased scarcity of capital.
What scarce? We've been at zero interest rates globally for a decade, and foreigners have been throwing money at Canada for that entire period. Real capital costs have been negative for years. We're now just returning to a more normal system, but then the baby boomers are gone. And then we go into a very tightly constrained system. So the capital flight coming to Canada, that is still going to be a very big piece of your solution. You just need to be able to divert it in a way that doesn't destroy the Canada that you know. If you can find a way to build financial products in Canada that allow all of this foreign flight to go into something other than real estate, that would be a win-win for everyone. Remember, the Federal Reserve is going to have to figure out a way to finance all of the green transition and all of the industrialization. If you can get foreigners to do that in Canada, go for it, especially if you can keep them out of real estate.
So in a recent newsletter from mortgagelogic.news, Rob McClister wrote that no one alive has witnessed a rate move like we saw in 2022, at least on a percentage basis. The next closest move was in 1978, when rates in Canada doubled from 8 to about 16%. But there was also much less debt in the economy back then. So what's different this time?
I'm going to toot my own horn for a little bit. I've always been a little bit of a Fed whisperer because the Fed, for the most part, ignores the financial world completely when it's making policy. It's more concerned with Main Street rather than Wall Street. I don't feel like I've got enough grip on the Bank of Canada to know exactly what they're going to do, but let me give you an idea of what I think the Fed is thinking. Interest rates and monetary policy, as a rule, are designed to regulate consumption. By raising and lowering the cost of credit, consumption rises and falls. That's always been the issue. Whether or not it's an appropriate tool for any given moment is irrelevant. That's the tool they have to use. And when the Federal Reserve looks at the demographic structure of the United States, it broadly likes what it sees because the millennials are a large generation that are now buying homes en masse and raising children en masse. And that means our system over the decades to come is very sustainable, and the tools that they have are still going to be appropriate because we're going to have a lot of young people. Young people have the demand is what they regulate. And so when the Federal Reserve looks at the situation around the world, they really don't like what they see. Most countries are more like Canada, where there just isn't a replacement generation without immigration, and most countries are not Canada and so cannot handle the immigration. Most countries are more like Germany or Italy or China, and we are looking at the end of what we consider normal economics, because there are no longer going to be enough young people in the world to carry things forward, whether it's childbirth, tax payments, or economic growth in general. So the Federal Reserve is not primarily looking at today's economic fundamentals in making these decisions with interest rates. I'm not suggesting they're ignoring them. Obviously, inflation is part of the conversation, but they are far more concerned about what happens after the next expansion. Because if you fast forward just 5 years, interest rates won't work in most places. They won't work in Germany or China or Japan or Korea or Taiwan or Thailand at all, because there's no more demand to regulate. And in Canada, it will only work if Trudeau gets his way and you're able to import 300,000 to 500,000 new Canadians every year for the next 5 years in order to generate the population that will then generate the demand. They're trying to prepare enough dry powder so that the next time they need to lower interest rates, they have enough dry powder to do it and make a difference, because they will be trying to shift the entire world off of the consumption of just one country. And so I don't think they're going to stop until they get to at least 6, because that's kind of the minimum that they've kind of penciled in as to what would allow them to get through the next crisis, not this one.
There's a popular saying, I'm sure you've heard it before, don't fight the Fed. You know, what's the incentive of government going?
That's fair.
What's the incentive of the government going to be over the next decade and the decade after that?
The biggest challenge the Fed is going to face is as the Chinese and the German systems fail, we need to double the size of industrial plant in the United States in an environment where baby boomer capital is going to be increasingly unavailable. So the credit costs that is necessary when Gen X is the one providing the credit are going to be huge. And so the Federal Reserve has to take steps within policy. I don't know if it's going to be interest rate policy, but within policy to loosen up credit to make that to be an easier process, because the alternative is inflation that's north of 10% for several years. I'm not sure there is a magical policy set that will let that happen, but maybe some version of quantitative easing might. I don't know. We're not just getting out of my skill set here. We're getting out of traditional monetary policy tools, because we are entering a fundamentally new era. So paying for that, financing that, at the same time we say we want to do the green transition, and all of that has to be front-loaded as well, because the 80% of the cost for wind and solar is installation. The fuel's free. Costs just as much over the lifetime as fossil fuels, but it's all front-loaded. That all has to be financed. And then, of course, paying for the baby boomers' retirement, because the baby boomers certainly didn't save enough to do it. So those are our 3 big expenses. The last one is lost money. The second one is a political question. The first one is what fuels the United States for the next 60 years. So all else being equal, I know where the Fed would prefer to put their effort, but the Fed's only one part of our economic management system. Congress gets a say in this, and Congress is the one who decides what happens to Social Security and our pension system and our healthcare system, and none of that is cheap.
You know, even though you're talking about the Fed, I think a lot of the major Western countries' central banks all move together. So
they're not. That's the thing. Not anymore. One of the things we've seen in this tightening cycle is, yes, other countries have tightened, but only by like an order of magnitude less. The Europeans have barely moved. The Japanese have only moved on paper. Just if you don't have a demographic structure where your interest rates shifts can actually affect consumption, then there's no point in changing them. So you're probably going to see a little bit of movement in places like Sweden that have a better demography than the rest, but there are only 2 other countries in the world that have a decent demography in the advanced world. That's New Zealand, where we're seeing interest rate moves, and France, which is part of the euro, so we're not.
Okay. Well, so in summary, what should Canadian mortgage lenders, brokers, and developers be mindful of as they plan their businesses for the next 5 years?
Well, let's start with the really trite thing. There is no Canada. There's a British Columbia, there's an Alberta, there's an Ontario, there's a Quebec, and they all have radically different property markets and radically different population structures, and that needs to be taken into account first and foremost in everything that you do. Second, to the degree that there is Canada, it's an immigration story, and that's a political question. You know you have to massively increase immigration in the aftermath of the COVID drop, simply in order to hold still. If you want to participate in the North American industrial story, you need even more. And you've got to find a way to thread that needle between the newcomers who want property and the people who are already here who can no longer afford it. How you manage that politically, I would argue, is the single biggest crisis that Canada faces for the remainder of this decade.
Yeah. Well, okay, let's talk about labor for a second. So I've heard you mentioned Canadian labor could be thought of as a competitor to U.S. labor, whereas Mexican labor is more complementary. Could you expand on your thinking there, and how does Canada fit into the mix?
It's a cost and a labor structure issue. So Mexico isn't unskilled. They haven't been unskilled for 20 years. They're semi-skilled. They're good at moving around pieces of metal. They're good at anything that requires eyes and hands that can't necessarily be automated, but they're even good at some types of automation. Canada and the United States are both good at the high end. We both do design. We both do high-end assembly systems. We both do intellectual work. We both do high-end wiring. And so there's always this built-in tension between the United States and Canada. The way it's worked to this point is each Canadian province has integrated more south than they have laterally. So for all intents and purposes in manufacturing, Ontario and Quebec and BC are American states in terms of manufacturing, and you're part of the milieu. But as Canada has aged demographically and the United States has not, or at least not as much, you're not going up the value-added scale anymore, but your labor is becoming more expensive. And perhaps some regulations are on top of that, complicating the issue. And that makes it very difficult for Canada to compete with the United States. Now, if Canada was on the other side of Mexico, you could benefit from Mexico in the same way that we can. But you're not. You're forced to try to integrate south. And in the case of Ontario, your best partner is Michigan and Ohio. Automotive, that works really well. But in the case of Quebec, it's aerospace. And the United States has some very pathologically formed opinions on aerospace. And one of the things we're going to see in the next couple of years is Airbus is going to go away. They get their aluminum from Russia. They get their titanium from Russia. And they get their engines and their wings from Britain. And Britain is applying for a free trade agreement with the United States, and we've made it very clear that one of the conditions is you join the Boeing family instead of the Airbus family. And so all of a sudden, Bombardier has to make some very, very hard decisions about their future. A lot of this is wrapped up in what Donald Trump did in NAFTA too. It is forcing a series of uncomfortable decisions on Canadian business about how to operate in an environment where the global structures are no longer there, and it really needs to focus on the United States and Mexico. As almost any country in the world will tell you, the most uncomfortable place is to be number one or number two on the United States' worry list. Until now, Canada's been like number 20 or number 25. And that's allowed Canada to ignore and avoid a lot of the scrutiny that comes in from when the Americans feel paranoid about something. We're not in that world anymore. As American interests shrink back to North America, all of a sudden Canada is going to consistently make the top 5 list. That's not a great place to be.
What are the opportunities that you see for Canada? And I guess more broadly, what does the future of the North American trade bloc look like to you?
Well, let's start with the punchline. North America is going to be the fastest growing economic bloc of size in the world for at least the next 30 years. And Mexico specifically is going to be one of the top 2 growth stories for that same time frame. So from my point of view, the hard work for the 3 countries has already been done. The intellectual infrastructure is in place. The trade deal has been ratified and implemented. We've already tested the adjudication mechanisms. They work. I feel very good about the long-term prognosis. The challenge is going to be that doubling of the industrial plant in the next 5 years as Germany and China go away. Mexico has already hit the ground running, and as of the 3 Amigos Summit, which just concluded today, all 3 countries are trying to figure out how they can move more and more of the semiconductors and electronic supply chain into North America, which is great. The problem for Canada is it's not clear that they can directly benefit from a lot of that. Canada does not have the green space or the population density or the availability of labor in its major cities to do a semiconductor build-out. And a successful electronics manufacturing sector requires different skill sets at different price points. And Mexico is perfect for the United States for that because we've got the high-skilled labor right on the border with their mid-skilled labor. They can interact very, very easily. Canada is also high-skilled labor at the same price point. So the Mexican labor system in this sector is very complementary to U.S. labor. The Canadian system would be competitive, and the only way that Canada could exist in that space if they do the high value added stuff and ferry the intermediate products to Mexico via air. There are sectors where that model works, cell phones for example, but for run-of-the-mill semiconductors, no. And Canada does not have a domestic semiconductor skill set that is up high. So the sort of sectors that we face the biggest vulnerability in as a continent: electronics, computing, cellular. That takes a lot of skilled labor. And Canada has a shortage of labor. So for Canada to pull this out of the fire, they need those 500,000 people a year. And they have to be here, and they need homes.
Awesome.
You already have a better social welfare system. You already have a better healthcare system. The United States does. Not that that's a high bar, but it does make it easier to integrate people from different backgrounds. You need to do more of that in more parts of the country as quickly as possible. And that means encouraging people to live somewhere other than just the gateway cities, so you can make this as broad-based and sustainable as you possibly can. And if you can pull that off, Canada will be an inseparable part of the North American experience, and it will enjoy years of the fastest economic growth in its entire history. And so will Mexico. And so will the United States. Ultimately, this is a really good story, but we're all going to have to do some uncomfortable things in order to get there.
So what about the smaller cities, and should we be trying to attract people to our smaller towns?
You need them everywhere. And I understand the difficulty of attracting people to something that's not a gateway city. But when I look at the economic potential of Canada, the manufacturing possibilities for Quebec and Ontario, we've already kind of dealt with. I think there's a very strong case there, but of course people are going to be moving to the city. But Canada is renowned for exporting unprocessed commodities, whether it's mining or agriculture. If all you did is do a little bit of processing and some value added in your secondary cities, particularly in the prairies, the jobs that would come up from that would be beyond lucrative and should prove sufficient to draw people from international. If you're looking for an example in the States, look at the state of Iowa. It's not the most exciting place to live, but it's really the only American state that has kind of invested in going up the value-added chain, not just from plant agriculture to animal agriculture, but the processing in order to do the soy crushing and make the oils and make the flour, whatever it happens to be, to send out a value-added product instead of just the raw commodity.
Okay, last question for you. Some of tech's biggest promises are pretty bold. For instance, robotics could possibly change the way geography matters with respect to manufacturing and labor, and artificial intelligence in particular. I mean, I don't know about you, but my Christmas break was dominated by everybody playing with ChatGPT. I don't know. Have you had a chance to play with ChatGPT?
I have, yes.
I mean, it's quite fascinating. What do you make of it all? Where do you see artificial intelligence, robotics, perhaps 3D printing? How do you see that all impacting your thesis and this coming decades?
I expect the rate of technological progress to slow considerably for the next 20 years. In order to do tech of any type, you need a lot of people in their 20s and their 30s who are highly interconnected in order to synergize, and you need a lot of capital to pay for the workers, to build out the systems in their prototype form, and then to apply it in mass, and everyone forgets this step, to keep updating the systems that are already in place as the technology improves. That takes more than everything else put together. We're not in that world anymore. The world's been aging out. We're running out of 20 and 30 somethings, and we're running out of capital because of the retiring boomers. So the pace is always going to slow. We're seeing that with the Silicon Valley layoffs right now. And then second, even if you can solve the production side of the equation with automation, robots don't buy stuff. Trade requires consumption. So you have to have both. And automation can only help with the first piece of that. So in places where the capital structure is good, and you still have a large number of young people, and you have a lot of consumption, their tech is going to continue. It's going to be part of the solution. It's going to continue to move forward, if at a slower pace. outside of that zone, you should expect a significant regression. So that suggests, again,